Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 74. Now I'm sorry this has been quite a while since the last episode, which was last November. Now the reason for this is because in November I was working quite hard on my third Don't Train course, which is on basically a full deep dive on the JetBrains Rider IDE. So I was very busy then. And then I finished that on New Year's Eve, so the 31st of December. So that was such a good way to end the year. And that's done and that's now out. And then January, I was planning to do this catch up. So no episodes in January. But from now on, I want to get back into more frequent podcast episodes moving forward. So if you're not subscribed, then subscribe for lots of .NET goodness. So in this episode, I'm joined by Jérôme Laban. I'm hoping I've pronounced that correctly.
That's very good. Thank you.
That's good. To talk about the Uno platform and a cool new feature, I don't know whether feature is too small a word, it's quite a big thing, called Hot Design. And Jérôme is the CTO at Uno platform. So welcome to the show, Jérôme.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me.
You're most welcome. So could you just give the listeners a quick intro to yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Jérôme Laban, so said it in French. So I'm a French person living in Canada for the past 18 years. And I've been working at Uno Platform and previously Inventive, so which is the company that was before Uno Platform. So we kind of spun off Uno Platform as a result. So I've been a .NET developer since probably 2001. I was developing on the Mono runtime at the time. So it's version 0.14 something. I built the IPv6 support for .NET at the time. So it's and the GC support for NetBSD at the time when it was all the rage. So that was that was nice. So I've been doing all sorts of stuff since then with .NET staying there, but kind of venturing into C++ for a bit, then to mobile, then doing all sorts of Windows oriented things, lots of Linux as well. Mainly because of Mono at the time. And then for the past 10 years or so, I've been working on what was not called Uno Platform before, but then working on making UIs and applications for mobile devices. Originally was with Silverlight, then gone over to Windows Mobile. It was an interesting time. And then, we open sourced the Uno Platform. So Uno Platform, for those who don't know, it's a UI framework. But it's a platform that contains a UI framework, but also a lot of other tooling to create your application that can run on iOS, Android, Catalyst, web, desktop, and running on Linux and other platforms. And we're working on adding even more platforms as we speak. And the idea is to use C# and XAML to get an application running everywhere. And about, I think it's 5 years ago now, we introduced the support also for WebAssembly. And that's been a wild ride to add support for that. And getting all those new features integrated. So my background is kind of jack of all trades in sorts of doing DevOps, doing cloud, doing mobile, doing Linux, doing contributing to the .NET runtime and opening lots of issues in Visual Studio. So that's pretty much what I do with Uno Platform and the .NET community in general. I'm also an MVP, so I can point to things in product groups to make the products go better.
That's a pretty impressive background.
Well, thank you.
Presumably now you're CTO, you're still getting to get your hands dirty in code, it sounds like it.
Oh yeah, I do get my hands dirty in code because mainly lots of complex things because of my background. Knowing how .NET works, I'm able to go dive deep into how .NET works. For instance, recently we had issues with the AOT compiler with .NET and go deep and try to fix things in there. Or Roslyn, for instance, we're doing with Uno Platform. We have our hot reload story that's getting better and better with every version, and go deep inside of Roslyn to see how hot reload works and try to fix things around and hopefully get Visual Studio updated and things. So yeah, I'm down into the code and making things work faster and better.
Nice. I think all hot reload and all of that kind of stuff will be stuff that's really good to deep dive into in this episode. Before we dig into Uno, though, just a few small reminders for the listeners. Firstly, this podcast has its own Discord community. So if you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a big Discord link there. And also, I have a monthly newsletter where I send out handpicked developer news items from the past month. And there's also a dev tip and a dev comic pick, as well as podcast updates about the show. So if you want to sign up, there's a subscribe link on the podcast website. It's just basically a great way to keep up to date with developer news in the .NET space. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. With Uno then, you've kind of highlighted what Uno is, and I know you wanted to talk about hot design as a main focus in this episode. But I think before we do that, like I know you've spoken briefly about what Uno is, but it might be worth going more into that. Because I personally, it's been a long time since I've done UI development. A lot of my stuff is like cloud and backend stuff. I've obviously heard of Uno platform, but I did play around with it before this recording, just so I had some context, but I've not actually used it. The only UI stuff I've done many years ago was like WPF and that kind of stuff. So I've got some kind of like XAML context, which, yeah, I'm hoping this hot design means I don't need to do any XAML, but we'll see. We'll see when we get to that bit. But I'm guessing a lot of the listeners are in the same boat where they kind of, they've probably heard of Uno, but haven't used it. So can we actually just talk a bit more about what Uno is and what it brings to the table?
Sure. So the main goal of Uno platform is to have your XAML and C# code allow you to create applications that can run across platforms. So that's the basics of getting an Uno app. So across platforms, including macOS Linux, Windows, to develop your application, but also run the application, and additional platforms like iOS, Android, and embedded devices and things like that. So it's all about getting your UI to run across platforms. So that's the base of Uno platforms with regards to the targets where it runs.
Does that include web as a platform as well?
It does. So WebAssembly is web. So for those who don't know WebAssembly, this is something that has been developed for, I think it's about 7 years now, which is the ability to run binary code compiled down to a kind of an abstract, a virtual machine that can run inside the browser. But the main goal of this is to not run text, where JavaScript, you download text and then the compiler will compile out to whatever is available for the machine. Where for WebAssembly, you compile like if you were to compile for x86 or x64 or ARM, and then get that to run in the browser. So the main point of this is to basically have the same thing run across the whole ecosystem, whether you're running locally on your device using Windows or Linux, or running in the browser because you can run it in a Tesla or on your fridge for whatever for that matter. So that's kind of the kind of scenarios that get WebAssembly. And a lot of people have been asking for WebAssembly as a result, because the main interest there is that when you write something in WebAssembly, it will basically run anywhere, because you don't have any kind of, you don't have to install anything. You just need a browser, and then it runs properly anywhere. So that's pretty good. And it's been evolving quite a bit significant for the past versions across all browsers. So we're talking, running on Safari directly on the device for iOS, running on Chrome on devices for Android, but also running on fridges and running on your, directly on your desktop. And that's super interesting for people that don't want to have to deploy something to end users' devices. That's the portion for WebAssembly.
With WebAssembly, a lot of the listeners would have probably heard of like BlazeWasm, so they've heard of it from that context. But as you say, the fact that it goes beyond that and it can be used like for almost like containers almost, and you can run it everywhere, that's probably something that a lot of listeners might not have heard about.
Yeah, correct. So the interesting thing here is that Microsoft is kind of pushing their tech stack is modularized in many respects, and we got the same thing with mobile. So on the website you have Blazor that is its own framework that sits on top of the .NET for WebAssembly, and .NET for WebAssembly is just something that you can reuse if you're developing your own thing for your own UI. You can just do whatever you want with it. So Uno is basically at that layer. If you take a look at a stack of technologies, Uno is kind of at the level of Blazor in a sense, but not completely. It's kind of bigger in the sense that it does non-UI things that Blazor does not do. It uses plugins for that. And then below that, you're going to get the .NET for WebAssembly that is developed, and that's what we're using. And we're basically using the runtime and SDK tooling untouched, and that what makes it kind of super powerful, because we're just sitting on the shoulder of the giant. And on the mobile side, it's pretty much the same thing. MAUI is actually sitting on top of .NET for iOS, Android, and Catalyst, and Windows to some extent. But the idea is that Uno is also sitting at the same level as MAUI, and then below there's the .NET for Android and iOS, and then we're using those features that are coming directly from the .NET SDK and runtime.
Is that why I went? So I did. When I did set up Uno, it did say as part of the install that I needed to install the MAUI workload. Is that because the MAUI workload installs things underneath that Uno's then using?
So in the details of this, the reason we're installing the Maui workflows is that we have a feature that is called Maui embedding. So the idea is that if you're developing an Uno app, but there's a feature that's super interesting that Maui has developed or Maui in the Maui ecosystem is used there, what you can do is have a kind of a separate assembly that will contain Maui code. And I don't know if you want to use a charting feature that's developed by Telerik, for instance, that does not have a version that is available for Uno directly, then you can embed the Maui version and then put it inside the Uno app and it will work as is. So that's why we're requesting during the what we have the tool that's called Uno Check. The tool is kind of setting up your environment with everything that's needed, and we're installing the Maui tooling because of that feature.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned about Uno Check. So as I say, it was my first time using Uno. And from my first experience, I went to the documentation, install, I think what was the command, .NET tool install -G Uno Check.
Correct.
I did that. That took a second. I ran it and it just checked like things like Android emulators or like what version of .NET, this Maui workload. It just went through and made sure it said, if it wasn't installed, it says, do you want to set it up and install it? And things like on Windows, it just said, you've not got long file name support, would you like to enable it? Yes. And then just all of these little things that you wouldn't think about. And it just did it and it worked. So it was such a great first time experience.
Well, that's good. That's good feedback. Indeed, that's something that we've wanted to have for a long time. So one of the things that's interesting is that, and Maui doesn't have that tool. So actually, the .NET, the Uno Check is actually based on something that's called Maui Check that was developed by, I don't remember his name, from the Maui team. And they kind of let that tool go because they're mainly focused on Windows, and Visual Studio is kind of doing the whole setup automatically. And what will happen is that when you're on Windows, you're probably set up properly if you're doing just installing Visual Studio for the most part. But the thing is that if you're on Linux or macOS, then there's nothing. So Uno Check can run on Linux and macOS and will set you up for everything that's needed to have the information set up properly. And so all the tooling, so making sure that you have all the workloads installed, Java installed, the Android SDK, and all of that, so that the experience is the best from the get-go. And so you don't have to fiddle around to find what you need to install and which NuGet packages you need to download and things like that. So we're kind of priming the environment so that you're good to go. Now, the interesting thing is that as the user base grows, we find new scenarios that we haven't caught up with, and we're including additional checks in Uno Check to kind of catch those and making sure that everyone's having the best experience.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think that guy, you couldn't remember his name. Is it Jonathan Dick?
Yes, it's John Dick.
So he's on the .NET Maui team, engineering lead and principal software engineering manager. So I didn't actually know that. I just Googled it when you were talking. So it's
thank you.
Just to give credit where credit's due.
Yeah, of course. It's an amazing tool. I mean, it's too bad that they kind of let it go, but it's super useful to be able to develop on other platforms. And one of the things is that Uno is running on Linux. So Uno Check is required to run there because there's nothing, like Maui's not supposed to run on Linux anyway. So that's, you can develop your app for Android, web, and desktop using Linux, using Rider and VS Code.
I was going to say, watching was it end of last year, the .NET Conf video, and watching your demo later on, I love the fact that you did that in Linux with Rider.
Yes.
And it's just like, I looked at the bottom and thought, hang on, that's not Windows or Mac. That's Linux. That's awesome.
Correct. I mean, and that demo was interesting because it was actually a Linux environment that was running inside a WSL. So it was not even a complete machine. It was kind of a hacking way to make that work. And I think it was Linux running in a container running in WSL. And then there was also the fact that there was the Android emulator running in there as well. So it's kind of a mix of everything, but it was working nicely. So that was a cool demo.
Do you have a nice, powerful machine for all that?
Well, yeah, it's not that big. It doesn't need the virtualization environment that doesn't need to. Probably an i7 with a bit of RAM is good enough. But yeah, you can't do that on an i5 for sure.
You mentioned about Rider, actually. So I think earlier on you said Visual Studio, I think. I might have imagined it.
Yes.
But then Visual Studio, Rider, I think there's an extension.
Correct.
And VS Code as well. Is the experience, if I was to develop an Uno app, if I'm not using Visual Studio, am I getting a second-class experience, or would you say they're all on par with each other?
Not at all. So the experience right now is that you have hot reload, you have the debugging experience. You can get mobile devices development. We're maintaining our own version of the debugger for mobile targets in VS Code. So you get the same experience everywhere. So now with regards to the environments with the using of .NET, there may be variations, of course, because each IDE has its own advantages and disadvantages, but you're going to get pretty much the same features when you're developing on each target. And there are some environments where you don't get anything else. So you can't do Visual Studio, the full Visual Studio when you're running on Linux. So you get the choice to go with Rider or VS Code.
Nice. In that video we mentioned, when I tried it before watching that video, I installed the Rider extension and did file new project, and there was the Uno stuff in there. But I saw you went to a site called, was it new.platform.uno, and you almost created it online or something?
Yeah, correct. So what we did is for VS Code, we didn't want to kind of integrate too early in a sense that we didn't want to put people in a portion where they would have only a UI to work with. So there are pretty much three ways to create a new Uno app, depending on the platform you choose. So either you use .NET New, basically run command line and then create your application and kind of guess the parameters that you want to get to. And I'm going to come back to how to enhance that one. Then there's the Visual Studio wizard. So when you're in Visual Studio on Windows, you can find new project, and then you get presented a wizard that will allow you to get all the options that you can set up for your application. So for instance, you can choose the platform, you can choose the language. So you can use XAML as an XML language, but you can also use C#. We have something that's called C# markup that allows you to just use C# all the way down and to create your UI. So if you're not a fan of XML, you can use that part. Then afterwards, you can choose your theming. You can choose all the extensions that we're providing. Because Uno also provides a set of extensions that will allow you to build your application faster, like anything that's related to navigation, settings, localization, networking, and things like that. So all that kind of features that are enabled, and you can choose to disable those features based on what you want. So that's the kind of feature set that is provided by that wizard. That wizard is developed using C# and WinUI, which allows us to create a version of this that runs directly in the web. So that's why we have new.platform.uno, which is essentially the same code that runs in the File New project in Visual Studio, but on the web. So there, when you go there, you get presented the same set of features. You can choose the .NET version. You can choose all the pieces that I mentioned before, but it creates you a .NET New command. And you can take that new .NET New command and execute that directly. So if you're on a Linux machine, for instance, then you can just open your VS Code, run the command, and it will create the solution for you. And then there's the last one, which is Rider. And in Rider, we've developed our own extension that contains a customized version of the templating wizard that runs directly in Rider. There's no way to kind of customize too much in there. So we had to develop our own version of it, but pretty much uses .NET New underneath and will create the application for you pretty much the same way that the other targets will do.
That's really cool. One of the options I saw in there on your video, I think, and you might have mentioned it then, maybe I missed it, but is the patterns like MVVM or whether you're using
Correct.
that or MV, is it UX?
MVUX, yes.
When I used to do like WPF ages ago, I used the MVVM pattern, so I know what that is, but I don't know what the other one is. I don't know whether that's something that can be explained on an audio-only podcast.
Of course. Yeah, of course, no problem. So there's three ways basically to develop your application. There's no patterns at all. When you basically put your buttons and then have button clicks directly and do what is called code behind, where you can just basically handle the click of a button and then handle everything behind. The problem with that pattern is that, yes, you do everything yourself, but well, the advantage is that you do everything yourself, but the problem is that you do everything yourself. So what that means is that, let's say if you click on a button and then you want to disable that button, then you have to do the disabling of that button manually by knowing what the button is and then change the state of that button. So that's why there's a pattern that's called MVVM where you can do basically data binding. So for instance, if you want to handle the click of a button, you're not going to do the click. You're going to be putting a command on it. So command is basically a class that has an execute method and a is enable, I don't remember, is executing event where you can say to a button programmatically just through the binding to say, well, should you be enabled or not? And then if you're executing something from your command, then you can kind of automatically disable the button just because you've put a command on the button. So that's the kind of thing that you're going to get. There's also all sorts of things because it's data binding. So you set data context at the root and then have everything manually managed. That's nice. But there's also a problem with that approach. And the main problem, the biggest problem for everyone is the fact that you run on the UI thread most of the time. And that's a problem of performance. So if you're doing things that are too complex, that can very quickly shoot yourself in the foot because it's going to be doing all sorts of lagginess in the UI. So you can do that by yourself. That's an advantage and an inconvenience at the same time. And that's why we've started developing MVUX. MVUX is kind of the pattern of MVU. So MVU is kind of it's model view update. And what you do is basically kind of update the UI from a model that's at the back. But the problem is that model is that you still have to do kind of direct manipulation of the UI. So what we wanted to have is kind of an in-between and allow to do data binding without having to do all the immutable stuff that you're going to get and that will force you to do state management in a very intrusive way that you can find in other ecosystems. And what we're providing is a way to have kind of a reactive expressions that you can bind to things like search button, a search box, and the state that goes along with the searching and things like that with the search results. So what you can do is basically bind your button to the text box and to the result list view, and then have the whole thing just be an expression to say, I tapped something in the text box, then I know that I need to have some refresh capabilities integrated into the list view to say it's searching, and then I want to disable the button, or if I click on the button, then I need to stop what I did before and then start again, things like that. So all of that kind of scenarios of threading, asynchrony, parallelism, state management, and all of that is just integrated to one pattern that is called MVUX, and that we're providing as an extension of the UNO platform.
That sounds nice, because if I think back to when, and I didn't do a lot of WPF, it was just quite a few years ago, and I was trying to do the MVVM pattern. It did feel like, it felt like sometimes I wanted to do something quick, and it felt almost like a lot of work to do it the air quotes right way. And it's like you're saying, I kind of wanted something in between. I guess it depends on what the app is. If you've got like lots and lots of developers working on a big project, you kind of need these patterns, even if it's a bit more work. But then If you're knocking up something like just a quick tooling app, I guess that's another question, actually. At the moment, if I want to create a quick, maybe it's just Windows only, a quick Windows desktop app that's just a internal tool, company tool. It's like a utility. It's just used by developers or something. I would probably jump to WinForms because it's so super quick and you can just double click on a button and get the code behind, and it's so super quick. With the MVUX, which sounds, or maybe not using a pattern at all, you mentioned that was an option. And especially now we've got hot design, so you can do this drag and drop, which we'll talk about later. Even for like an internal tool like that, might Uno be a good thing to jump to use as well, rather than using WinForms, which is obviously quite ugly as well, I guess.
Well, so and that's interesting that you're asking this. So hot design is kind of our stab at bringing over a lot of developers that are doing WinForms, because of the fact that there's a tooling. So, but let's talk about hot design afterwards. So you want to make an app that's for developers. The beauty of the thing is that Uno doesn't force you to do any of the pattern management or patterns that MVVM or MVUX or whichever you want to use. You can just do your application, developing your button and clicking on it and then doing things directly. And if you don't want to, if it's okay for your app to just freeze while you're doing something or just not report any status, then develop directly in the code behind. That's fine. It works as well. Now, the thing is that we're trying still to improve that development experience. And MVVM is interesting, but the thing is that you still have to do quite a few things by yourself. State management is one, asynchrony or parallelism is one of the other things that you need to do manually. So that's where MVUX come into play. So there's a learning curve, of course, like any pattern. But once you get used to it, you get to create applications pretty quickly. So it's kind of up to you in a sense of, do you want to spend time making an application that will work, that you will be able to maintain a bit later in the time. And then if it ends up not being a proof of concept for your internal tool, then you'll be, set up already to get your application running faster or maintainable more easily. Now it's just a matter of choice. So with regards to developing your application, and that's something that Microsoft has been trying to do for a while, it's the design surface. I mean, WinForms kind of was the golden standard before the WPF was there with regards to developing your application. And one of the big thing about that was that you don't need to care about the UI. That's where it got interesting. If you're developing something and you want to put a button, you don't care if your button is placed or kind of, it doesn't need to be fluent, resizable, and things like that. You want to put it there, and then you don't care if the application is completely static and it works. So that's the kind of thinking with what WinForms was. And with WinUI, UWP, Microsoft had a designer. And when they moved to WinUI, so kind of the version after UWP, they kind of dropped it and they said, well, we have our reload. There's no need to have a designer. And while it's okay, it makes sense to a lot of extents to be able to just to develop our application just using hot reload. And that's something that we're trying to do. So for those who don't know what hot reload is or haven't used it, the idea of hot reload is you create your app and then you start coding in it while it's running. And then you press the button for hot reload when you've added a class, modified a method, changed whatever, the UI or something like that. And then the modification will be applied immediately in the running app. So you don't need to stop, which kind of takes a lot of time to do when you're building. And building is kind of the complex part. So that's a portion of hot reload that makes it interesting. And Microsoft kind of banked on that one, saying hot reload is the way to go. And it does make sense to have a designer tool that will kind of duplicate the work that you can do with hot reload. But the problem is that there are lots of people that are kind of, hooked onto having a designer because they're not designers. They're not UX experts. They don't know how to create a button. They don't necessarily care about how to create a button and how to lay out something in XAML. So the probably number one feature that was requested on the Microsoft, the user voice or whatever is call it now, is specifically, where's my designer? And it's not just that, it's also on the MAUI side, there's no designer, there's previewers, but there's not designers. And so that's the current state of what that is for designers. And we're trying to answer that with hot design.
Well, with hot reload, I guess another thing is kind of not everyone has multiple monitors. And if you've got your code window and you've got your actual app running on a different monitor, then you could use hot reload code and see it. But actually, one thing that is quite nice, and we can talk about this, hot design, is the fact that you're actually in the real app and it's there and you're editing and you've got this designer in the actual real app.
Indeed.
We've spoken about hot design. Let's dig into hot design.
For sure. So just before we get into hot design, one of the tools that I use to do hot reload without having to deal with the fact that the window is, if you have a single monitor, is there's a Power Tools, the Windows Power Toys feature that is called Keep on Top. And if you do Control-Win-T, it will keep your app in front. So you can just continue. You have your app that stays on top, and you can do hot reload on there without having to just do back and forth and have your app go to the back. So that's something that you can use instead.
Just while you talk about the Power Toys stuff, there's so many useful things in there, isn't there?
Oh yeah,
it's so powerful. I'll include a link to the Power Toys. I'm sure a lot of the listeners have heard of it, but if you haven't, just check out the show notes, and I'll include a link there.
Exactly. It's an amazing set of tools. And Clint Rudkis, which works on this, has been super nice driving that project. Shout out to him for that.
Oh, just before we move on to hot design, and just going back to the hot reload thing, I saw in your video, which looked really nice, is when you made a change and you trigger the hot reload, in your app, you had kind of like this, what was it called? That events pop up?
Yeah, we're calling that the hot reload indicator. So it gives it says what's happening.
Yeah, and just things like whether it's successfully updated, but also if there was a compiler error or something, you saw that in your app and it was like a big red warning. So I thought that was quite a nice touch.
Yeah, we're doing things like this to enhance the experience because, kind of particularly if you're on Rider and on macOS, on Linux or with using VS Code, you don't get that experience going back to Visual Studio. So having in the app to say, well, the last update that you made actually worked, or what was changed, or if it actually didn't work, or sometimes it's just because we have our tooling is just not able to connect to itself. We're running a few things in the back that the app needs to connect back to be able to do the hot reload. And if it doesn't work for whatever reason, then that tool, that indicator that we have at the top is going to tell you what happens.
Nice. Right, hot design.
Yes. So hot design. So we talked about previously about the experience with basically the designer that you have when you're in WinForms. Same thing happened with WPF. And then you have a hot reload that's completely on the other end where you don't have a designer, but you basically have to guess by yourself everything that needs to be designed in your app. So if you want to put a button, you need to go into your XAML file and then know that the button is called a button and then put that at the right place and know what it will do. So what we envisioned to do, and it's now available as part of the beta that we released. I don't remember exactly which day that was, but a few days ago. There's the idea about that tool is to say, we want you to be able to design your app while it is running. So what will happen is that you start your app empty or existing app or whatever. And then in that indicator that shows at the top, there's a flame that allows you to kind of put the application in a design state. And what will happen is that your app kind of reflows and provides you with the designer while the app is running. So what will happen is that you get, on the side, you're going to get the tooling for the choosing a control. So if you want to put a button, a date picker, a calendar picker, custom control from Telerik or something like that, it's going to appear in the list on the left. And then you're going to be able to drag and drop that onto your running app directly, and it will show up as it should. And then once you're done putting your control on the screen, then you can exit the design mode and then continue using your app. And the good thing is that once you've put your control on the design surface when it is in design mode, then in the IDE, the XAML file also contains the modification. So it's kind of a two-way type of change that you can make where it's not, that's why we're calling hot design, is that you're designing your app while it is hot running. So that's the important distinction between the tool of just designing or just hot reloading. And we're in the middle providing that experience.
I'll definitely include a link to your video. And so who was the other guy on the video? I
Nick.
His name.
It's Nick Randolph.
Nick. So that .NET Conf video where he was demoing that quite heavily, I'll include a link to that in the show notes because that shows it so well. And I really like the fact, I think it's part of the demo. Do you know, like when you're developing on this whole developer loop thing where it's kind of like you make a change and you've got to wait a while and we want to decrease that to be more productive as developers. But it's more than just that, because in his demo, he kind of went to the app and clicked through the UI, like logged in and a few different UI pages, got to the page he wanted to work with, clicked, you mentioned that flame little icon that kind of like an overlay in the actual, presumably it's only the debug version, the end users won't see it, but little
That's
flame
correct.
button. And they can click that and then edited that page there. And all the data that had come from the database or wherever it came from, like the images and the lists of collections of stuff, it was already there. So the data binding, your toolbox where you could like drag an object on like a repeat or whatever,
yes,
and say data binding. The designer UI knew about the data that was in memory to data bind it. The images that got dragged on show the actual images as you were dragging, resizing that image control. And that's, we're talking about WinForms. That's kind of like forgetting how WinForms is ugly. It was productive to develop, like little tools and stuff. But this takes that and takes it a step further because you're seeing your data while you're doing it.
Exactly.
I've got to admit, my jaw dropped a few times during that video.
Yeah, it's the amazing tool. That's the thing. So when you're talking about an actual designer, and I don't remember. So WinForms had to some extent the ability to show some of the data that was synthetic data. WPF had something that was called design time data. But the problem is that your design time data, it's just always out of date or completely useless, or you don't have a way to do it properly because you have a custom control or something like that won't work. So that's where having the actual data, if you have an API call that returns something with images and your actual data, you can actually data bind to it. And when you're clicking on let's say a text box or a text block, and you want to show something, then we're providing a way to see all the properties that are available for a specific object that's on the UI, but also we're providing a data binding experience where the control has a data context that's flown from its parent, and you can click on it and the UI will present you with all the information that's available, whether it's immediate data, like for instance, your data context is a class that has 3 properties, and then you can choose with those 3 properties and their actual values to see what's in there. But if there's a need to go down, my class, then you can see that as well. So that's the kind of experience that we're providing for developers to experience exactly what that is. And that's particularly important when you're talking about, and that's another feature about hot design, is the ability to view your application in different modes. So you can have your application using the desktop version, which shows the full screen and says kind of 4x3 kind of application, but you can also see it using in the mobile form factor. And as a result, what that means is that if, for instance, you had a string that was too large for that mode, then you're going to see that it's going to be clipped or trimmed for the UI to fit. And then you can go there and change the mode and say, well, that needs to wrap because it doesn't work, or it needs to be, shrunk a little bit because it needs to be shown differently. So that's the kind of mode that we're seeing there. And having the ability to view the actual controls properly with their data is kind of invaluable if you're developing with complex apps. And of course, being able to design your app while it is running, because the error or the page that you want to design is 17 pages away because you're making an app that's super complex. Well, that's a time saver, because if you make a modification for a single text block because it's not aligned properly, and then you have to stop and start again, and then click 17 times to go to your app, to your location where you're editing, that's a time waster. So that's the kind of scenarios that we had in mind with this hot design scenario.
Yeah, the number of times I've considered writing some kind of, not playwright, but like this was before playwright, but like a web kind of script which would just go through a website to get me to that 17th page, just because of this exact problem, because it's such a pain. You've got to click through. And a lot of this 17 pages you're talking about, some of the pages you might have lots of required fields you've got to fill in.
Of course.
So you've got to type in them all in. So it's like minutes and minutes just to get to that 17th page.
So one of the other scenarios that hot design is addressing, and you probably remember that with WPF, actually all designers have that problem. So in Forums and WPF is if you have a custom control that draws its own stuff, that control will not show up. And the biggest reason for this is that the designer would have to execute your code. And if the designer executes your code and your code is problematic in any way, then it crashes, but it's perceived as the fault of the designer, not the code from the user. So that's why, Microsoft, they kind of allowed that for a while with WPF. And then they said we got too many reports of the designer crashing. So we said, no way, we're not letting anyone execute anything in the designer process. And what happens is that you can basically design up to a certain point. But if your application is mostly user controls or custom controls, then you're out of luck. And that's what we're addressing with hot design is basically you can, whichever content that needs to be displayed, it's going to be displayed. And then if it's your code, you're going to be able to design it. If it's not your code, then we'll show it, but that's it. It's going to be something that's selectable as a whole. So for instance, in that demo that we had for .NET Conf, we placed on the screen a control that is called live charts, if I remember correctly. And that live charts is basically a charting control that you can just drag and drop onto your surface. And then you can data bind live with new data, and the charts are going to show up immediately as a result. So that's the kind of cool scenarios that you can get when your application is running, but you're still designing it and get data out into it.
Yeah, that's really cool. And wasn't there in that video something about a Figma plugin which integrates with it as well?
Indeed, we do have a Figma. So the main problem that we have, the projects have in general, and particularly those projects that do have a design team that is not doing any kind of development, is that they're mostly using Figma lately. And the biggest problem is that people that are developing their UIs using Figma, when they're handing it over to developers, then they have a problem because the developers don't know how to use Figma. And they probably don't want to use Figma in the same ways that the designers don't want to use any developer tools. And what happens is that the developers are going to be using kind of rulers and things to try to guess the numbers, the colors, the paddings, the margins, the font sizes, and things like that to kind of re-implement the whole thing that comes from Figma into whichever target that is. So we're talking XAML in that context. And what we've developed is a plugin that runs directly in Figma that allows to take UI that has been developed in Figma using templates that we're providing for material in that case. And you place your UI in the right way on the UI. And then you can export that into either a C# markup or XAML. And then you can copy paste that into your application and then get your app running as a result. So that's kind of a helping in reducing the waste of spending time from a developer trying to guess the work that the designer has made just by exporting everything up and making that run directly in the app.
That sounds like with this and with hot design that I probably don't need to write XAML again.
That may be. Well, that's our goal. That's our goal. The thing is that we're making large strides to improve the tooling, and our main objective is for you to be able to design your application pretty much from start to finish using hot design, and your application, you don't need to stop your application and edit anything. So of course, if you're having to write code, you're going to have to go back to Visual Studio or VS Code Writer and edit that code. But that's pretty much the idea. It's just don't stop your app and build it that way.
So when you said at the start that when you create a new Uno project, you can choose between XAML or C#. If you choose C#, would you not be able to use Hot Design, or does it work with that as well?
No, so not yet. So the interesting thing about XAML is that at the very beginning, the reason XAML was built is that because it's kind of a machine understandable language, easily understandable language. And originally, you may remember Blend. The tool was supposed to do that kind of designing. And if you were making modifications in Blend, your XAML ended up being kind of spaghetti or not super readable. So it kind of meant that if the designers used Blend to design their app, then the developers would not be able to use it afterwards. The XAML, they would just use it plainly and then not touch it. And what makes it interesting for us is that XAML is kind of easy to parse and easy to write. C# is a little bit more complex to deal with. So it's not something that we have yet, but we're definitely thinking about adding C# support to Hot Design.
You actually preempted my next question then, because I was going to ask, because a lot of design, and I hadn't thought of Blend actually, but designers I have used in the past do exactly like you just described. It's kind of like, okay, you've got a nice designer, but the code that it creates is like, cover your eyes up. You did actually show the XAML in the video, I think, that it produced, either you or Nick, and it actually looked super clean, like quite a nice. It's what you would actually strive to develop if you were doing the XAML manually.
That's correct.
So that was quite nice. The thing that you mentioned before about switching between different modes, form factors, so you can switch between a mobile view,
yes,
and or desktop, all this kind of things. I guess just to add to that, and when you showed it in the video, switching between that is super responsive. So it's not like a big wait for you to switch between them. I think it was Nick that demoed it in the video. He was just like clicking through and it was just swapping within like a fraction of a second.
Indeed.
The different views. So yeah, so as you say, if you've got like a text overflowing, it's not a big job to switch over to another view to make sure it doesn't overflow on mobile or something.
Exactly. There's that, and there's because it's a running app, anything that you have that is actually doing any kind of responsive design. So if you have what is called a visual state, when you say, well, my window or my content is of a specific size, then it needs to reflow in a specific way because it's kind of a mobile centric way of doing things. That's where the information is going to flow the right way. So that's the kind of thing that shows up. One other thing that's available in that toolbar is the ability to switch between light and dark theming. So you can see your application behaving in those two ways. And particularly, that's one of the interesting thing about that mode is that if you're specifying your styles, and that's another feature that's in Hot Design, is that you can select your styles for your controls. So for instance, if you want to have a kind of a lightly dimmed text block, you can choose a style that works that way. But if you were to change the color directly and then you set it to dark because you're in the light theme, and then you go to dark theme and then it's black on black, it's not going to work. So that's the kind of things that you can see very, very easily because you can switch modes in Hot Design.
Oh, nice. So I'm a huge fan of that, of all my applications in dark mode. If I'm creating a brand new application, is it that easy to have it to support just a brand new Uno application, both light and dark mode?
No, it's there by default. I mean, that's
so good.
It's there by default. You don't need to do anything. I mean, so the important thing to get your app being properly compatible with it is to make sure that your controls are not using explicit colors, or that if you do, then you use colors that are kind of supporting. If you're using explicit colors, that they're supporting light and dark theming or high contrast for that matter. But all the controls that are available in Uno are compatible with light and dark themes without any issue.
I did see in that video, I heard mentioned, and I didn't quite click what it was, but something called Uno Platform Studio.
So Studio is it's kind of so Uno Platform Studio is the name that we use it's a product name, if you will. And in there we put Hot Reload, we put Hot Design, and the support for our Visual Studio Code. So it's kind of a package that we'll be providing for our customers, because Hot Design is going to be a paid feature of Uno Platform, which, by the way, I don't think I mentioned that. So Uno Platform is free and open source. All the code is available for free and you can use it directly without any issues. The part of the free offering is Hot Reload. So if you sign in, then you're going to get Hot Reload and all the hot reload indicator things available to you. And then once we do get out of the beta, the Hot Design feature is going to be a paid offering.
That's cool. It's open source. Well, not this, but and then it's free. So even for commercial use.
Even for commercial use.
So not using hot design, you can just do all this stuff. Oh, that's awesome. I did see on your pricing page, it said all this, and then it said that like you've got like enterprise support. So that's presumably, apart from this hot design, that was your main revenue, I guess.
Yeah, it is our main revenue source. The idea is to make it sustainable in the sense that we're basically managing Uno platform in multiple ways. We got community support where basically on our Discord channel and directly on GitHub discussions and Blue Sky and others, we're basically answering questions as fast as we can. But we're prioritizing our paying customers when they have an issue, and let's say, for instance, a specific feature is not working for whatever reason, then we're basically taking their issues and putting them on top of the backlog, and we're fixing those faster than anything else. So that's how we're maintaining the platform. And of course, we had the Uno Studio, and that includes Odd Design is going to be it's a different set of offerings that people can buy to develop their apps.
I feel like I really need a use case to develop this now because it sounds so cool. But kind of, as I say, a lot of my stuff is kind of like cloud and back-end stuff and architecture stuff. And I just want to have a reason to play with this. It's very, very cool. I did actually want to, one silly little app I want to build at some point, because I use the Pomodoro technique quite a lot, and I've not found a timer that actually I'm happy with. That does what I want it to do. So maybe that's one that's like can be like a desktop one, but then it can integrate with a mobile and something like that.
Yeah, of course. So it can be a web one, it can be things like that. And by the way, if people want to test an app very quickly, so we're talking about new.platform.uno, that's one thing, but it's very specific to creating apps. But if you're a .NET developer, you definitely need to use the NuGet.info site. So this is an app that is running Uno, and it's the NuGet Package Explorer that allows you to take any package that has been public on NuGet.org and see what's inside. And it shows you all the internals, like a targets file, a props file. You can see the inside of DLL. So if you click on the DLL, you can see how it was built, the versions. You can see, all the PDBs. You can even see if it has source link enabled. You can click on the link from a file that was used to build the DLL, and then you're going to see that source in GitHub if it's there. So all that kind of things that you can get with that tool. And I use it daily. So if there's anything that shows up that is broken for you, let us know. But it's if you're using NuGet packages, or if you're creating NuGet packages, that's a super useful tool that is built with Uno platform.
That's very cool. So what was it? NuGet.info, was it?
It's just HTTPS NuGet.info. I'm
going to have a look now. And obviously I'll include that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's a tool that we worked with Claire Novotny a few years ago. And the idea of that tool is to basically replace the WPF version with the WinUI version. And we're going to be publishing a version of it that runs directly on Linux very soon. So on the Snap store. So that's the kind of things that we're doing with NuGet.info, and it's super useful, super snappy. And we have a Net 9 version that's coming up very soon as well. So pretty cool tool.
That's very cool. I went to it, and the very first in the list was obviously Newton.json, which is like very, very popular. I've clicked open, and yeah, you're right. It's expanding out. I can see all the different things in. Oh, that's definitely going to be a go-to. This is good timing because I don't know whether you saw about doing dev tips.
Yeah, I was actually going to suggest that one. Well, actually, I have two, so we can have another dev tool. But go ahead.
Cool. Before we move on to dev tips, is there anything you wanted to cover that we've not covered about?
Yeah, one thing that we're going to be that we do support with Hot Design is the ability to do Hot Design on mobile devices. And mobile devices, what happens is that the real estate is not big enough. And what we're doing is just allowing your app to be developed directly on the device, but with the ability to and you see the tooling windows outside of your mobile device. So you can basically move things inside on the device, but see the windows for manipulating the UI and see data bindings and things like that from separate windows. So that's one of the things that we're providing as part of the beta.
That does sound cool. I need to see a video of this. It does look very cool. Is there one that we can shove in the show notes or something, or is that not at that point yet?
For the mobile parts?
Yeah.
No, it's available as part of the beta.
Cool, awesome. So dev tips then. You've already done one. You did say you had two.
Yeah, I have two. So the other one for the dev tips, I don't know if you're a .NET developer, you build stuff. So what that does is that you're using MS Build. And if you're using MS Build, that means you need to know about bin logs. And if you don't know about bin logs, you can go to msbuildlog.com I think that's called. And it's called Binlog Viewer. That's developed by someone from Microsoft, Kirill Ozenkov. And I think he's a developer in the MS Build team. I don't know if he's changed a few things, but the idea is that when you're building something from .NET, if you're on the command line and do .NET build, and at the end you do -BL, it will create a file that's called msbuild.binlog. And that file will contain all the details that you have on your build. So all the little things about files and tasks and see the inputs of the C# compiler and how the files are packaged and debug anything that you want. And it's a lot better than using the text that goes outside when you're doing a build. When you do a variables build, there's way too much to look. And you can't search, you can't do, there's not everything, by the way. So having a binlog is a lot better. And there's a second tool that's related to this that is called the project system tools if you're using Visual Studio. And you can record bin logs for builds that are made by Visual Studio because there's no command line at that point. And also you can get to debug design time builds. So design time builds are the one that Visual Studio runs kind of in the background to make IntelliSense work properly. And if they fail for any reason, then IntelliSense will kind of bail out and not do anything. And you can diagnose those errors using the project system tools to see the bin logs that have been generated by Visual Studio. Just know that you have to put your Visual Studio in diagnostics logging, otherwise you won't see anything. So that's the tool that I use pretty much every day because build errors are difficult to diagnose, and that is a time saver.
Nice. This is big about memories because I've not used the binlog and the binlog viewer, I think the app's called, in years. We actually had Stuart Lang doing a talk. I run a user group called .NET Oxford, and this was years ago. He did a talk on MS Build, and he raved about this this tool.
It's an amazing tool. It's progressing so much. It even shows up, if you have issues with your NuGet packages and doesn't restore properly, or it restores, you're not sure which version is restored, it's going to show you the packages in a structured way. That's super cool.
It's funny to hear about these all the software that you kind of like maybe not used in a while, and then you realize it's still being updated and things. It's like I've recently had to use WinDebug.
Yes.
And so it's going to, or WinBag, I think it used to be called.
WinDBG.
Yeah, and I've not used that in years and years, and it was just this horrible, clunky thing. And no, it's still obviously quite manual. It's not like debugging in Visual Studio either, but it had it just looked a lot better. It had dark mode and all this kind of stuff, and it's like, this looks way more modern. Another one,
way better.
Do you remember MIRC?
Yes, I do. I used quite a bit.
That's still being updated.
Is it? Oh wow. Yeah, no, IRC is something that I'm not going to. I mean, Discord has kind of replaced that for me. But I'm pretty sure there's an underground scene over there that's still there.
It's been decades since I last used that, but then maybe it's not still. Like I looked a couple of years ago in one of the .NET Oxford user groups. Like afterwards, we just geek out and stuff. This was when it was virtual, like just after COVID, and we suddenly, I don't know who spotted it, but it was like a few months ago. Was at that point in time was the last release. I'm just having a quick look.
I mean, I would have guessed that MIRC would have been gone with ICQ, but no, it's not. It's got the same error.
ICQ. Has it got the older version? It doesn't say the date on it actually now, but yeah, I think it's quite recent. But yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a total tangent, but it's just, I just find it funny, like older apps still going on.
That's true.
So my dev tip, it was kind of more like a soft skills thing, and it's basically just remembering the importance of planning. I was recently reminded, and funny enough, a fiction book I was reading about the 7 Ps. Now, there's a few different variations of this. The one, pardon my French, but in fact, I can't use that term, can I? Because you're going to get offended if we say pardon my French, but pardon my bad language. Pardon my bad language, but it's prior proper planning prevents piss poor performance. And it says there's a few variations, but it's just, I've not heard that term in such a long time. And it's true though. Just things like it does apply to some different aspects of life, but also software development. So like if you are working on a feature, not just rushing in and starting coding, and instead like whatever note-taking app you use, just break it down, like think through all the different bits, like the happy path, the unhappy path, what could go wrong. And quite often just doing this and not jumping straight into the code, I've taken a different approach because of just thinking it through and thinking, oh, actually, there's this edge case that my initial solution just won't work. And just by thinking it through and breaking it down, I've saved a lot of time and not gone in the wrong direction. And also just by breaking things down, I find that because I've broken down a full plan, when I'm actually doing the work, I procrastinate a lot less because I've got this list of small, succinct things to do, and I can just focus on the next thing on my breakdown. And yeah, I just find that that's now the habit I'm into. If I pick up a new user story off the backlog or what's in the sprint, the first thing I do is open Obsidian, open up a new note for that user story, break it down, plan it out, and think it through not on paper, but in that note. And that's just makes a massive difference. So that's my dev tip, the 7 Ps.
Yeah, it does. The interesting thing about that kind of rubber duck tooling, kind of rubber duck, explaining of things, I find LLMs like ChatGPT quite interesting in that regard, because it can guide you through the non-standard paths of thinking about something, because it knows about some pieces of particularly if you're explaining a feature, and then it will ask you questions about what could go wrong or what will go wrong because you may not have thought about it. So it's it's kind of an enhanced experience as a result to go through that kind of steps. That's nice.
It's funny, I saw a meme, I think it was last week or something on, I can't remember if it was Blue Sky or Twitter, I'm not going to call it X, Twitter. And it was basically, someone had posted saying that he quite often finds with like ChatGPT and stuff, writing out the question to ChatGPT before he actually presses enter, it actually helps him solve the problem. But it's like writing it out and doing that rubber ducking thing. But the person that posted this screenshotted that and just put, yeah, it's called thinking. Yeah, it made me laugh.
That's what it is for sure. That's a good one.
Cool. I think so. Was there anything else you want to cover?
No, just if you want to start off on Uno, you can join us on Discord. You can join us on Blue Sky and X. You can ask questions directly on our GitHub, and you can get started on platform.uno get started, if I remember correctly. There's a big green button on the right that you can click to get started and see how Uno does.
Cool. So just with that, a big massive thank you for joining us. I've really enjoyed the Geek Out, and we went deeper in some places than I thought we were going to go, which is perfect for the target audience. So I'm really chuffed we did that.
And of course, there's no unhandled exception.
Well, there will always be that until we get rid of nulls, and
yes.
And I think that's going to be a long way in .NET. I know there's lots of things on like the socials about the result pattern now. People are the air quotes content creators are like one person did a video on it, then everyone's doing videos on the result pattern and everything. So it's so maybe one day that we'll do it natively in .NET and get rid of nulls altogether, but who knows?
It's not there yet.
Not there yet. Awesome. And thank you everyone for listening. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception. And I'm not on Twitter anymore. Well, I am on Twitter, but I don't really use it. I'm mainly on Blue Sky. So I'm danclark.com on Blue Sky, and that's my main social. Or the best place you can actually get in touch with me is Discord. And Jerome's on Discord now, on our Discord now, for the podcast. And that's on the website, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.